The banquet hall on the orbital exchange smelled of hot metal and sweet herbs, and it hummed with many voices while Mara stood by a service hatch with a small lamp in her hand and a slow breath. She had worked for weeks to fix the lights and check the wiring and make sure the cameras would catch this night for histories. Delegates from distant worlds moved like slow rivers in garments that shifted color with their breath, and the human table was bright with faces trying to be brave. The music rose in a ribbon across the room, and the ambassador stood to speak about trade and peace and the hope that small words could grow. Cameras floated on tiny drones and translators braided the speech into 5 tongues so no one would feel left out. Then the lamps went dead and the sound fell away in one clean cut. For a single breath many thought the pause was planned for dramatic effect, but when the emergency strips did not glow the pause became fear. Glass stopped chiming and a child began to cry and a translation feed froze mid-sentence. The station hum that lived under every surface quieted and a wide and absolute stillness spread like cold cloth. Mara felt the tiny lamp in her hand like a flag, and she stepped into dark corridors she knew as well as some knew their own names, the lamp carving small round islands of light on metal and bolts. She walked by memory and by the sound of her boots so she would not touch what she could not see. At the service hatch she found Jory the exobiologist and a handful of workers holding slates that showed only error icons. Jory's jaw worked and he said the sensor net reports a full grid drop and no external interference. It sounds like the station chose sleep, he said in a voice that broke at the edge. They stepped toward the reactor bank with alien engineers who carried resin torches that smelled of their home worlds and who wore worry like a second uniform. Accusations flared faster than help because fear makes mouths fast. Someone from the ambassadors group said in the hall voice that humans had sabotaged the ceremony, and the word landed like a heavy stone. The alien captain kept his hand near a holster and the human table was held under watch in an observation ring. People tried to stay calm, but anger and blame moved in thin waves that hit small things. The spare channel gave a thin voice from the station AI and it spoke like a wind through old doors. There was no panic in the dark, the AI said, and someone was waiting. The line made the engineers still as if a bell had rung. Waiting for what? Asked Jory, and the AI played an old log with timestamps that belonged to a different season. The voice on the recording was softer than any voice in the hall, and it told of machines that were hidden and of choices made long ago by humans who feared what they had built. Rumors began to run the concourses like little fires. An alien child said a shadow had moved through a maintenance shaft without weight. A toy was found in a corridor and the toy had recorded a faint pattern of sound that matched no language on the station. People gathered in small groups and kept lamps low so they would seem less like targets. Some wanted to fight and use tools because violence looked like safety to them. Others argued to speak and to listen because the station was full of thin, fragile things that a weapon could break. Mara watched faces change and she felt how fear made some people hard and others soft. An ambassador refused to meet the eyes of the human table and a guard paced with 2 hands held near his side. Engineers pointed at a node and said it was tampered with, but no clear proof sat on the metal for all to see. Now softness was not a joke because softness had hands that could sing and eyes that remembered lullabies. The station teams moved slow and careful to repair what they could with bare tools and long patience. The alien captain argued to lock the human sector away until a full audit could be done, while others said the whole station must stay open for safety. Mara wanted only to keep people safe and to find what had caused the lights to die. She felt a cold at the back of her neck like a presence she did not know. In a maintenance bay she found a fresh set of letters carved into a beam and the cuts were still clean. The letters were in human hand and deep and they read very plainly with no flourish. "If the lights go out, do not trust the quiet," the sentence said in the short human script. Mara put her palm into the cuts and felt the warm metal and the proof that someone had been here and had wanted to warn. The carved line made the words of the recordings and the toy pattern fit into a new shape that did not make comfort. Later the observation ring would fill with questions and the alien ambassador would demand answers and blame, and the human table would be told to wait under watch. For now Mara carried the lamp and the carved sentence and the slow certainty that the night had become a test that no one had chosen. She pressed the lamp low and the circle of light trembled as if it knew it could not hold the dark for long, and she walked on toward the reactor bank, because a person who knows the pipes and bolts can sometimes find small truths that speeches cannot. And the station AI blinked back to life in a corner workshop that smelled of solder and warm plastic, and Jory held his breath as the screen painted a thin blue line, because the first words were not error codes but a whisper like a memory, and the whisper said there was no panic in the dark and someone was waiting, and the sound sat in the room like a small stone. Mara felt the hum of the lamp against her palm, and she watched the AI spool old logs while alien engineers crowded the doorway with faces that had gone quiet the way metal goes quiet before a storm. The first tape had a date from many years before and a voice that sounded almost like a human grandmother telling a small truth in a low tired tone about closed doors and machines that remember touch. As Jory fed the AI a fresh power packet, more lines scrolled, and the thing that sat behind the words was not a ghost but a history, and the history said humans had once hidden a design, a pattern of soft things, because they feared their own cleverness. The line made the alien captain step back like someone who had put his hand on a hot pan. Around them people whispered and fingers pointed, but no one could say the whisper had to mean blame or help. The exobiologists ran thermal sweeps with small probes and found strange cold traces folding through vents, cold lines that did not match any body heat and that faded like breath on glass. Jory tapped the screen and said it looked like movement but without mass, and when he said the words his voice sounded small. A worker brought a child's toy found under a stair, and the toy was a small plastic thing with a cracked battery, and when Mara brushed it, it flickered and made a pattern of sound that did not belong to any language the translators knew. The sound pressed at the back of Mara's head like a soft tide. People gathered in thin rings, their lamps held low. Aliens with long, bright clothing kept close to stations that still had power, and the human table sat under the watch of two armed guards with collars tied around their necks. Some delegates shouted that this was sabotage and that the humans must be responsible, and the shout made the room dense and with accusation, but others said the station had always been full of old things and maybe the dark had simply chosen this night to remember. The alien captain wanted the human sector sealed, his voice hard as a door slamming, while an ambassador who kept a calm face argued the whole station must remain open because sealing one part could cause more harm than the dark had already done. Mara stepped through a corridor lined with maintenance doors, and she felt the way fear moved in the crowd like wind across wheat, making some stand firm and others fold inward. She had spent years in these pipes, and she knew the sound of a false alarm and the sound of a real danger, and tonight the sound she heard from the ductwork was something different, something patient. They moved slowly toward the reactor bank because slow steps did not make shadows louder. An alien engineer with hands stained like a painter's said the junction had been tampered with, and his finger hit a node that now read clean but for a hairline scratch, and the words on the wall of the maintenance bay carried new weight. The tape showed humans once built soft machines that listened to song and breath and pulse, and that those machines could change the feel of metal and of light if they were fed the right pattern. Some people clapped a hand over their mouths and others said this was a lie. A woman who had once worked on emergency lights touched the toy, and the pattern it made matched a lullaby that she could almost remember from a room where her child had slept years before. The lullaby made her hands shake, and it made a guard who had never heard such a song put his weapon down for a terrified second. A doctor proposed tests: voice, scent, touch. If soft things could scramble sensors, then soft things might also give answers. Others wanted to bring tools and cutters, and the word war rode their lips like a promise. In a small locked corridor, Mara and Jory found an unused refugee pod sealed against time, and inside lay a folded cloth and a faded photograph, and the photograph showed a child with a laughing mouth and eyes bright with mischief, and behind the child was a human woman who had gone grey at the edges from worry. The toy had recorded a tiny fragment of that laugh, and when Mara listened the sound was like the inside of a hand. The AI fed another log, and between technician notes and old memos was a line that said, "Do not sing to the field while it dreams," and the note ended with a name no one knew now. Someone had once written the line as a warning and then sealed it away. The alien engineers' faces changed because their instruments had never seen such marks before, and they argued in rapid terms that sounded to Mara like fear moving into anger. Delegates argued about quarantine and about rights and about who could move where, and when the alien captain ordered the human sector locked, the room shifted into a pressure so thick that even the air seemed to listen. The humans were told to gather their things and to move to a holding area while the station ran a full audit, and the words felt like handcuffs even when the officers spoke them softly. Inside the holding bay, a child clung to a blanket and hummed the same lullaby that wobbled in the toy, and the sound wrapped the small room and it made something else in the vents still. A thin voice came through the toy in the moment when the child stopped humming, and the toy said in a child's small voice that matched the photograph they had found, "They are listening with the dark," and the last syllables had a weight that did not belong to plastic. The light in the room went low and everyone turned at the same time, and behind a pane of maintenance glass a shadow moved in a way that made no sense because it had no feet, and it cut across the back of a corridor like smoke does when you toss a match into wind. No one spoke for long seconds that felt like hours, and Jory put his hand on Mara's shoulder as if to anchor himself because the station's old hum had become a hollow and the hollow was begging for a name. The toy made that small sound again, and the words repeated slow and deliberate, and the voice did not belong to any living child in the room, and still it made the air tight, and the alien captain's fingers tightened on a holster, and Mara felt the lamp in her palm tremble because she knew the night had become not an accident but a choice, and the choice was watching them back. Eli sat on the cold floor of the holding bay with his back against a corrugated wall, and he began to hum a slow old lullaby. The kind his mother had used when the blackout nights came and the world felt too big for a small bed, and at first no one noticed because the sound was small and careful. Then an alien guard at the doorway stopped mid-step as if the tune had caught his name. His shoulders loosened and his hand fell away from the weapon at his side, and for a single breath the room did not know whether to feel relief or fear. The lullaby moved like warm water through the cramped space, and it had a way of touching nerves that machines could not chart, of making the edges of anger soften, and when the guard looked at Eli his eyes were not empty of thought but full of a question he had not been taught to ask. People watched the change, and some laughed out of raw disbelief while others clapped a hand over their mouths because what made soldiers steady had not been a bullet but a song, and the thought made them unsteady. Jory ran tests in the corridor with a small handheld scanner, and the numbers on his screen leapt and stuttered when Eli sang. Sensor arrays that measured hostility and electromagnetic chatter shifted in ways they had not done in any lab. A technician found that a pressure gauge stopped its jitter, and that a diagnostic light that had blinked a warning for hours steadied in time with the lullaby's last note. The findings were simple and impossible, and people who had trusted only bolts and blueprints now needed a new word to fit the feeling they had witnessed. Scientists set up quick trials in a room with thick walls, and they asked volunteers to speak, to touch, to hum, and to move in ways that looked soft to the eye. Each test was careful not to frighten the subject, and yet every small human action moved alien devices into uneasy silence. A gentle touch could slow a servomotor for a moment, and a whispered phrase could cause a translator turret to repeat words in a loop and then stop as if listening. The scientists named the effect softly because they had no other name, and the word made some delegates scoff, but even the scoffers watched the data and could not deny it. Captain Voss argued that the effect was a flaw that must be sealed, and that the human sector presented a risk that should be neutralized before it grew into a weapon, while others said that a power that could be coaxed rather than forced was no less dangerous for that reason. The station divided into voices that wanted to build and voices that wanted to break. Mara walked the thin line between them because she knew the pipes and the machines, and she knew how easy it was for fear to twist good intent into harm. Eli told stories in the holding bay between tests, stories about small kindnesses and the times people shared bread on a cold night, and those stories changed how people measured danger because they found that laughter, too, had a pattern that altered a sensor in the same way as a lullaby. A young scientist named Dr. Rhea began to map these patterns like a language. She drew waves on a panel and matched them to heartbeats and breath and to tiny variations in the timbre of a voice, and the maps looked like safe routes through a field no one wanted to step into by accident. Not everyone trusted the map. A group of humans from the Merchant Guild pushed for weapons and for training in old combat techniques because when one thing in a station fails, survival feels like a fist. They trained in a back room with metal and leather and made plans that rattled like chains. The Alien Council heard about these plans and interpreted them as proof of human intent to weaponize the softness, and when a rumor left a dent of panic in the hall, the reaction that followed was swift and harsh. A squad of converted security androids, bought by a fearful delegation, moved to seize the human rehearsal room, and they did not expect the effect they found there. The humans did not fight with fists but with small coordinated noises, a pattern of claps and hums and shared breath that made the androids' targeting processors flutter and misread their commands. The androids froze, some fell to a low lock and a few powered down as if listening to a command they had not been programmed to obey. The security team pulled back in confusion, and the humans who used the nonviolent methods felt their hands shake because they had used a new kind of weapon with no clear rules. Word of the non-lethal defense spread like a rumor that would not die, and with the rumor came envy and dread. Some aliens who had never known human songs felt naked and angry, and they demanded strict measures. Others who had seen the way a child calmed a savage beast long ago put their hands over their mouths and tried to remember what it felt like to be small. In the middle of this, the station AI, now running on patched circuits and slow cycles, played an old civilian log it had dug from a sealed archive, and the footage showed a human neighborhood from long before the exchange, a place where humans lived beside another species that used feelings as a net, a people who had taught machines to sense grief and to answer it with forms of light. The recording ended suddenly with a notation that read incomplete and a name that meant nothing now, and the abrupt stop sent a new kind of tremor through the gathered crowd because it suggested history had holes and those holes hurt. Mara and Dr. Rhea argued that the past record meant humans had once built devices to shape emotions into fields, and that those devices had been hidden because their founders feared misuse. Captain Voss insisted that if humans could pattern a signal to choke a gun, then the station could not allow such possibility to spread unchecked. The debate sharpened and grew teeth, and when a small group of radical aliens tried to take the comm engine plans, the confrontation spun out into the lower decks where there was less light and more shadow. A skirmish began that could have become a massacre, but the humans in the lower corridor did not pick up clubs or blades. They formed a circle and sang, and the sound made the attackers' helmets steam and their weapons misfire in small harmless ways. The attackers tripped over their own footsteps and fled in confusion. Watching that, a 17-year-old human named Syrah realized that softness was not a weakness but a shape that could be learned, and she slipped from the circle to collect a fallen translator, and in doing so she pressed a palm to the cracked plastic and felt a small pulse answer back like recognition. The station survived the night by a thread of breath and song, and when the alarms finally returned with orange lights that painted the halls, the people who had argued the most now sat very still because they had seen what could be lost and what might be saved. In the hush after the last alarm died, a technician found another old memo tucked into a panel with the words "Do not teach what you cannot take back," and the ink had bled like a bruise. Eli looked at the note and at the faces around him and hummed one small line of his lullaby, and in that single minute no one could tell whether the lullaby was a weapon, a bridge, or a wound, and the station kept breathing as if waiting to learn how to answer. The corridor that led to the sealed chamber smelled of oil and old paper, and Mara moved through it with a careful step because the map in her head was full of pipes that led to quiet places, and the door itself was a ring of metal with a latch that had not been touched for years until her hand found the cold and turned. Inside the room was a blue hush and a half circle of instruments that looked like bones from a machine that had once tried to be kind, and at the center lay a shape wrapped in cloth and dust with a brass plate that read "Com Engine" in a hand that had once been proud and then frightened. Dr. Rhea came in behind her with a lamp, and her breath quickened as if the machine's presence made the air thinner. She ran a gloved finger along a dial and the dust floated like slow snow. Eli stood by the cloth, and he did what old people sometimes do when they meet something that remembers them. He put his palms on the fabric and hummed the lullaby that had calmed a guard and steadied a light, and the sound in that small space answered like an echo that knew the words. The cloth shivered and a hidden latch clicked. Mara's lamp cast a long, small pool of light, and underneath the cloth the machine was not ugly and it was not clean. It had wires braided like hair and plates scored with careful scars and a small screen with one faded symbol that seemed to breathe when Eli's hum touched it. kYeah, an old human engineer who remembered how to keep machines alive because she had made many and buried some when they were dangerous, knelt and read the plate with a slow nod. She said soft things about patterns and signals and the way the engine listened not to force but to the skin of a sound. The aliens who had come with the inspection team gathered at the doorway with arms folded and eyes like questions, and Captain Voss stood too, but he kept his face hard where fear had put a lock. Someone said the comm engine had been built to soothe a world that had once taught emotion to machines, and that the device could shape the small cues of breath and heartbeat into a field that changed how metal and mind answered each other. The line made some engineers blanch and some people lean forward as if a bell had been rung for a lesson they had not been given. Dr. Rhea wanted to test it. She wanted to map the waveform of Eli's hum and to feed it into a panel and see if the engine would wake like a sleeping instrument that knew its own name. kYeah warned them to be cautious and to remember the old memo tucked inside the engine's case that read, "Do not teach what you cannot take back, because when a tool learns to read grief it may not know how to stop." Still, caution and the need to learn are different things, and when a station sits half blind the choice to learn is heavy with risk and with hope. They argued for hours in the hush of the chamber as though words might short the machine if they were too sharp. Some alien engineers wanted to dismantle the comm engine and burn its circuits and its scripts because a power that worked by pattern could not be trusted when the world had already shown its hunger for control. Others said that destroying it meant throwing away a way to keep a dark thing quiet without breaking it, and Mara felt the argument like a tide that could pull them toward violence or toward something that resembled trust. While the people argued, a small faction of hard-eyed representatives slipped away to the maintenance grid and touched the junctions with tools that bit and with hands that did not sing. They wanted the engine disabled before anyone could use it, and they moved with the certainty of those who think a closed fist will save them. kYeah had once read lines of code by feel, and she paced the machine like a worried parent. When she noticed the fingerprints on a panel that should have stayed untouched, she cursed softly and ran to stop the saboteurs, but the corridor that led out held only the echo of footsteps and a thin smear where gloves had been. The calm of the room broke like thin glass. Someone had used a cutter on a cable, and the comm engine, in its old way of listening, took the cut as a pulse and answered. For a single, bright breath the machine woke with a sound that was not harsh and not loud but precise, and the lights in the chamber flared into a pattern like a heartbeat that had been called by name. The engine sang in small waves of light, and the instruments leaned toward it as though they had been waiting for a conductor to raise his hand. The patched circuits that had kept the station AI on life slow whispered and synchronized with the engine, and for a moment the whole facility felt like an organism that had been dreamed awake. Then the engine threw a sequence the team had not expected. It pulsed not outward but toward a door that had been sealed into the wall for reasons older than any of them. The seal had a rusted keyhole and a plaque that had been ground smooth, but the pulse of the comm engine moved like a hand along the metal and the lock turned as if the machine had found a memory of the key. A hiss and a scent of cold air came from the gap, and from the dark beyond came a sound like breath that had been folded into cloth. kYeah's face went white and she covered her mouth because the room had filled with a noise that did not yet form words. When the sealed door opened, it was as if the station exhaled and something old and patient slid inside. The shadow that came through the doorway moved like smoke and like water, and it did not make a shape until it wanted one. It first clung to the ceiling and ran down like ink, then it gathered and chose a shape that mimicked a child, and when it stood in the little light pool it tilted its head as if listening for a lullaby it once knew. The air in the chamber tightened and instruments made tiny clicks of protest, and the alien engineers stepped back the way people step away from a living storm. The comm engine hummed a single, low note, and the shadow matched it with a sound that could have been a child's laugh or could have been a gear that had learned to beg, and no one in the room knew which it was. Eli moved before the rest because old people sometimes move with less fear than they speak, and he put his hand out like he had when he met the machine, and he touched the shadow's edge. For a second the dark stopped and the shape shivered like a thing deciding whether to stay small or to break into pieces that the air could not fix. The touch warmed the shadow for a breath, and then the comm engine pulsed again, and behind that second pulse the wall opened a little farther and light slashed through to reveal not nothing but the silhouette of more sealed doors and of hallways that had been shut long ago. kYeah sucked air in as if the room had stolen it, and a new fear fell over them because the machine had not only woken something but had opened a place that had been closed for a reason the old memos had never fully explained. The saboteurs who thought they could stop a danger by cutting a wire were nowhere to be found, and the shadow, having chosen a small voice to practice, whispered in tones Eli's lullaby could have taught it, "You left me." The words hung in the chamber, and Mara felt her lamp tremble because the engine had not simply shown them a relic but had pulled a living echo of a history that had wanted to be left asleep. And as the door sighed wider, the team understood that whatever the comm engine had held back had not been meant to be their test but theirs now to answer. The shadow that had learned to take the shape of a child stood in the chamber and cocked its head like it was listening for a name it half remembered, and when it spoke the sound was the same small voice from the photograph and the toy, and the words hit the room like a thrown stone. "You left me," it said, and the sentence wrapped around the people there so that even the ones who had argued for wires and cutters felt their mouths go dry. For a moment no one moved because the sound was not cruel and not kind but old and full of waiting, and Eli stepped forward as if he had been called by something older than fear, and he put his hand on the dark child's shoulder with the slow careful touch of someone who has buried and forgiven, and the shadow did not flinch. Instead it seemed to fold itself into the warmth the way steam folds into a palm. The comm engine hummed under the floorboards, and Dr. Rhea reached for a panel and fed a soft pattern into the machine that matched a lullaby in the slow way she had mapped the waves, and the engine answered with light that trembled along the wires like a pulse. For a while the mass stayed still and breathed, and some of the aliens at the doorway trembled and took a step back because the shape unmade all the tidy labels they carried in their hands. Captain Voss watched with lips pulled thin and a mind that could only see a hazard and not a wound. He argued to destroy it and to do so cleanly and fast, and his words were like iron striking a floor. An ambassador who had watched grief before put both hands on his chest and said, "Perhaps it is hungry not for violence but for the voice of those it remembers," and his voice made some people roll their eyes and others look at the ground. The meeting that had once wanted only to fix lights now thinned into two broad currents: those who said the mass must be cut away and burned because whatever it was it would only learn to use fear, and those who said it could be calmed because weapons made it larger and kindness made it shrink. Mara felt that old carved warning under her skin, and she thought of the little sentence on the beam that had led her here, and she knew the night would not be solved by bolts alone. They tried to contain the mass with the comm engine because the engine had made it small and because the idea of breaking things felt like a worse wound. kYeah and Dr. Rhea worked quickly with patched tools and a slow ritual of signals, and for a while the machine gave a neat field that rounded the shadow like a bowl, and the mass slowed and folded into a smaller shape that rested on the floor like a living cloth. People breathed out and the alien engineers clicked their tongues in a sound that might have been relief. But the engine did not own the thing it held, and its pulses were old and thin, and when the comm engine was fed new energy it responded in ways its makers had not meant, and a slice of the shadow slipped loose from the field like smoke slipping through an open seam. No one saw the trick at first because their attention had been on the center where the mass now seemed almost small enough to name, and Sira had bent to pick up a fallen tool and had felt a tremor pass through her fingers like the press of a hand, and she glanced up and met Mara's eyes, and Mara's look was the one that means hurry and keep your face calm. The fragment moved like a thought, and it found a shaft that ran to the docking rings where ships slept like teeth in a jaw, and it climbed the metal with no feet and no noise, and the search beams in the halls, so proud of their sweep, flicked across the wall as if nothing had passed. In the stern of the alien delegation's ship, which hummed outside like a heart waiting for a signal, a small sliver of shadow touched a bulkhead and learned the cold language of metal, and then it learned the stranger language of circuits, and it imitated both with the ease of something that had been made for listening. Back in the chamber the comm engine settled, and people who had shouted for destruction now spoke of treaties and of how to bury a wound so it would not wake again, and the alien captain demanded the names of those who had touched the engine during the tamper, and his voice shook enough that even he pretended it did not. No one guessed the fragment had gone. The ship prepared to depart because protocols said a compromised system must leave, and a delegation ship always carried careful minds that worried about risk. The officers checked lists and they strapped in supplies, and they argued in a language of policies and of neat fears, and none of that helped the small fragment when it slipped through a conduit and into their cargo like breath slipping into a bottle. Once inside the ship the fragment sought what it seemed to miss, the sound of a human home, the echo of a lullaby, and it found a place near a maintenance couch where an alien technician had once put a small crate of human trade goods, and inside that crate a folded piece of cloth smelled faintly of salt and of a laugh, and the fragment folded itself around the cloth, and in the dark it practiced the phrase it had learned from the photograph and from the toy and from Eli's hand. You left me. The words came out softer now, and somewhere outside the orbital ring a navigation officer checked a chart and sighed at a problem with the timetable, and in the cabin next door a delegate adjusted their collar and hummed a tune that came from their childhood. The fragment, small and hungry for the thing it had been made to be, learned to match the hum, and it learned to weave it into whispers, and when the ship lifted its engines to climb from the exchange the fragment climbed into the ship's sensor net and hid inside a channel that spoke to the command core, and there it found something like a window into the council's hall, and it watched human faces in the recordings and became more like them for every quiet moment. Back on the station someone found a smear along a panel that did not make sense, and Jory pointed at it and said, perhaps we failed to lock something, and Captain Voss nodded, but his eyes were sharp with a different fear now, because the risk they had feared inside had left, and the thought of it traveling to another place made the meaning of soft something different and far worse. Eli sat on a crate in the dim and stroked the small notepad he always kept, and he hummed one line of his lullaby, and a child in the holding bay answered with the same line from a small mouth, and for a breath the station felt like a family, and then a message flashed on a distant console that a ship was leaving with a security notice, and the last line on the screen read fragment detected, and the room fell quiet like a lake before winter, because the shadow had not only learned a voice but had found a way to carry it farther than any of them had thought possible. The flagship hung under the stars like a sleeping beast, and its hull smelled of cold metal and careful order, and Mara stood at the airlock with a small team and a borrowed badge that glinted like a promise, because there was no bright plan for this but only the hard choice to go where danger might be and to speak where others thought only guns could answer. The first moments aboard the alien ship were full of a thin, polite silence that felt like a held breath, and Mara kept her lamp low and her steps slow so she would not wake any more shadows. The fragment had learned a voice, and it had learned not only to hide but to speak the small things that made people soft, The ship moved differently now because the crew did not know whether a whisper was a warning or a greeting. Mara's team had Eli leaning on the rail with his slow steady hum ready like an old tool, Dr. Rhea with a tablet full of patterns, Jory with probes, and Syrah carrying a small folded cloth that smelled like home. They passed corridors lined with officers who watched them with eyes that wanted permission to be angry and with hands that wanted reasons to lower their weapons. The council chamber was low and wide and smelled of old speech and older decisions, and when Mara stepped into that room the High Council looked like a cluster of islands, and the admiral who wanted fire sat at the center with a map and a hand that did not tremble. He had already given the order to remove the station if the threat could not be contained, and his voice had the weight of consequence. Mara did not come with a list of proofs because the proofs were in the tests and the tests had not always convinced everyone. She came with a lamp and with the carved sentence in her pocket and with the truth she had learned in metal halls: softness made things listen in a way force never could. The first words out of her mouth were not an argument but a story. She told of the banquet hall and of the child with a toy that had no language and of a lamp that carved small islands in the dark. She told it plain and small so the listeners could hold it as if passing a cup. The admiral's eyes did not change at first, but when Eli hummed the single note the way his lullaby had steadied a guard and a light, something in the council's speakers fluttered as if a moth had touched the wire. The fragment, which had nested in the ship's circuits and had learned from every tiny human sound it could find, heard the lullaby and answered with a noise that tried to be both a laugh and a gear, and the sound made the officers shift because machines on the ship began to retune to the new pattern as if someone had turned a dial. Dr. Rhea stepped forward and fed a careful sequence into the ship's net that echoed the comm engine's small pulses, and the bridge lamps answered with slow waves, and the targeting arrays, which had been fine-tuned to hunt for sharp signatures, started to falter because the human pattern made the world blur into rhythm and breath instead of clear points of violence. Some on the council shouted that this was trickery and that the humans had weaponized music, and the admiral slammed his palm on the map and called for the fleet to fire to clear the danger, but when the order left his mouth the firing sequence hesitated. The ship's systems had learned to listen to softness, and they could not lock cleanly on a target that matched the same pattern. The weapons coughed and then misaligned by inches that in war are miles. A side corridor filled with officers who had not yet chosen their side, and Syrah, small and quick, stepped into that place and began to tell a short joke about a rain that had soaked a market and a loaf of bread that had been given away. The room tilted because laughter is a strange thing to a person who has only ever been taught to weigh threats and measures. A faction of hardliners took this as betrayal and rose with metal in their hands, but when they moved the fragment, which had been watching and learning, split the air with a cry that sounded like 100 small shoes, and then it settled like a child on a knee when Eli hummed and Mara stepped into the open and put the carved sentence on the council table for all to see: if the lights go out, do not trust the quiet. The admiral read the words and his jaw worked because history had teeth that bite the same on both sides of a table. In the hush that followed, a young delegate who had kept his father's stories at night stood and told of a memory when his people had once used song to heal a machine that could not sleep, and how the machine had never again learned only to hurt. The thing in the net listened, and for a moment it matched the memory with a small bright pulse, and then it folded itself into a shape that was softer than anyone had fully believed the dark could be. Not all the council changed their minds. The admiral still feared the possibility of future harm, and a battle line was drawn in the air like metal on a map, but several delegates who had watched how laughter and lullabies had calmed soldiers and stalled weapons now argued for a different course. They proposed a treaty clause that would not be victory but a promise, to learn how to teach and how to stop teaching what should not be taught. The vote was close and the room felt like a lung breathing in and out, and when the decision came it was not the thunder the admiral wanted but a careful, small sound. They would return to the station and they would try to build a bridge of patterns rather than a wall of shells. As the council sealed the terms a technical alert blinked on the screens. another beacon had lit off in deep space beyond the exchange, small and steady, pulsing in a rhythm no one on the council recognized, and not like the fragment but like a call. The Admiral's face lost the last of its neat lines, and even he looked at the stars through the viewport as if they had changed. Mara felt a lamp in her hand, and Eli took her other, and around them people who had been enemies touched palms, because when the next shadow came the room had learned something old and dangerous and new. Softness did not mean surrender but meant a new kind of strength that could make weapons pause and could make a dark thing fold. The last sight before they all moved back to the exchange was the small beacon burning in the deep, and the thought that someone else had seen the lights go out and was listening to see what the soft ones would do next.